If you think power is loud, you've never seen it lose control in silence. The words didn't come from the CEO. They came from the room before anyone even realized the game had started. Inside the glass-walled summit room in downtown Manhattan, everything looked perfect on the surface. Polished marble tables stretching 20 feet long, soft golden lighting reflecting off $300 coffee cups, and a $500 million contract sitting in the center like it owned the air itself. Richard Bennett, billionaire CEO of Bennett Global Holdings, leaned back in his chair like a man who had already won before the first move was made. His voice cut through the room with effortless arrogance. "Let's be honest," he said, glancing at the waitress standing near the edge of the table. "She's just here to refill glasses. People like her don't read contracts like this." A few quiet laughs followed, the kind that don't fully commit but still choose a side. Alicia Carter didn't respond. She stood in a simple black uniform, tray lowered, eyes steady, not on Richard, but on the document in front of him. The room assumed she was invisible, just part of the background noise of luxury business deals. But Alicia was listening differently, not to the words spoken out loud, but to the structure beneath them. A subtle misalignment in the translated Japanese clause caught her attention, something everyone else in the room had missed. Richard slid the contract closer to the Japanese delegation with a confident smile. "Everything is clearly aligned," he added, as if that ended all discussion. The translator nodded, uncertain but silent. The Japanese executives exchanged brief glances, unreadable. Alicia's gaze didn't waver. She stepped forward just one pace, enough for the room to notice her for the first time. The air shifted slightly, not loud, not dramatic, just off balance. Richard didn't even look at her fully. "Did I ask for service?" he said calmly, dismissive. That's when Alicia finally spoke, her voice steady, precise, and unexpectedly fluent in Japanese. The entire room froze. Even the translator stopped mid-breath. Richard frowned slightly, sensing something he couldn't immediately name. Alicia's eyes stayed on the contract as she said again, softer this time, but sharper in meaning, pointing at a single line no one had questioned. And in that moment, the energy in the room changed, because what she was seeing wasn't just a document, it was a flaw that could cost $500 million. And Richard Bennett was about to realize he had been wrong about the one person he chose not to see. The silence that followed her words did not feel empty. It felt expensive, like something in the room had just lost value without anyone hearing it break. Richard Bennett finally turned his head slightly, his expression tightening as if he was trying to decide whether what he just heard mattered at all. The Japanese delegation shifted in their seats, their attention now fully locked onto Alicia Carter, the waitress standing near the edge of a negotiation that was never supposed to include her. The translator hesitated, glancing between the contract and Alicia as if searching for permission to understand what she had just said. Richard exhaled through his nose, forcing a calm smile. "Let us not interrupt a critical discussion over misunderstandings," he said, voice controlled but edged with irritation. He tapped the contract once with his index finger, signaling authority more than logic. Alicia did not move away. Instead, her eyes returned to the same clause she had noticed earlier, her focus narrowing with quiet certainty. She spoke again in Japanese, this time slower, carefully enunciating every word as if she was not translating the document, but revealing it. The Japanese executives reacted immediately, one leaning forward, another whispering something under his breath. The translator froze completely, realizing he could no longer mediate what was being exposed. Richard's posture shifted for the first time. Not fear, not yet, but something closer to disruption. He looked at the clause she was referencing, then back at her face, trying to place where this confidence was coming from. "You are a waitress," he said, almost as a reminder to the room rather than a question to her. Alicia's expression did not change. She gently placed her tray on the side table, freeing her hands as if preparing for something that required full attention. The room, once filled with the soft confidence of billion-dollar certainty, now felt uneven, as if the foundation of the deal itself had subtly tilted. One of the Japanese executives finally spoke, asking for clarification in a calm but firm tone. Alicia responded immediately in fluent Japanese, pointing out that a critical revenue distribution clause had been translated incorrectly in a way that significantly altered ownership percentages. The numbers she referenced were precise, too precise to be accidental. Richard leaned forward now, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the document more aggressively. The same lines he had reviewed dozens of times suddenly looked different under her interpretation, as if they had been hiding in plain sight. A quiet murmur spread through the room as someone realized the scale of what she was saying. Alicia continued, not raising her voice, not seeking attention, simply following the logic of the contract as if it belonged to her understanding all along. The Japanese delegation exchanged a serious glance, the atmosphere shifting from business formality to controlled alarm. Richard finally spoke again, slower this time, as if measuring each word. "How do you know Japanese at this level?" he asked. Alicia paused for the first time, not out of hesitation, but calculation. The answer she gave was simple, almost understated, but it landed heavier than anything said before. Because the contract was not the first thing she had studied that morning. The room did not recover from her last sentence. Instead, it deepened into a kind of tension that made every small sound feel amplified, like the soft rustle of paper or the faint hum of the air system above the ceiling. Richard Bennett stood still for a moment longer than anyone expected, his eyes fixed on Alicia Carter as if recalibrating the entire situation in real time. The Japanese delegation remained silent, but their attention was no longer passive. It was investigative, sharp, and increasingly aligned with her interpretation rather than his authority. Alicia did not look triumphant. She looked precise, as if what she was doing had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with structure. She turned one page of the contract slowly, her finger tracing a specific clause before speaking again in fluent Japanese. Her voice carried a level of accuracy that made the translator visibly uncomfortable, as if every word she said was bypassing him entirely and connecting directly to the decision-makers on the other side of the table. Richard finally leaned forward, placing both hands on the table now, his confidence beginning to fracture into something more analytical. "I reviewed every line of this agreement personally," he said, attempting to anchor the conversation back to control. "There are no errors." Alicia's gaze lifted to him for the first time since she began speaking. It was not confrontational. It was observational, almost clinical. She responded in English this time, slowly and clearly, so everyone in the room could understand. "Then the issue is not that there is an error," she said, "but that the error was designed to look correct." A quiet shift moved through the room at that statement. One of the Japanese executives reached for the document again, pulling it closer with renewed attention. The translator adjusted his glasses, visibly unsettled. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, but he did not interrupt. Alicia continued, now alternating between Japanese and English as she broke down the structure of the clause with calm precision. She pointed out how a subtle difference in phrasing altered ownership distribution across multiple subsidiaries, effectively changing control of revenue streams that extended far beyond the immediate deal. The numbers she referenced were not vague interpretations. They were exact, calculated, and internally consistent in a way that made denial increasingly difficult. A senior advisor in the room quietly opened a tablet, cross-referencing the figures she mentioned, his expression shifting as he confirmed what she was saying. The atmosphere changed again, this time not from confusion, but from realization. Richard noticed it. His eyes moved between the advisor and the contract, then back to Alicia. For the first time, his tone lowered. "Where did you learn to read agreements like this?" he asked. Alicia did not answer immediately. Instead, she turned another page, stopping at a section that had been heavily marked with legal annotations. Her voice softened slightly, but remained steady. "Not in a classroom," she said. In silence, while people assumed I was not worth teaching. That sentence did not sound emotional, but it landed with weight. The Japanese delegation exchanged another glance, this time with clear concern directed away from her and toward the structure of the deal itself. Richard straightened, trying to regain control of the moment, but something had already shifted beyond his influence. Alicia closed the contract gently, placing her hand on it, as if finalizing a conclusion no one else was ready to accept. The room waited, because whatever came next would no longer be about interpretation, but exposure. The moment Alicia Carter placed the contract back on the table, the room did not immediately react. It hesitated, as if waiting for permission to understand what had just shifted. Richard Bennett remained standing, but his posture had changed slightly, no longer relaxed, no longer fully in control of the environment he had curated so carefully. The Japanese delegation now had the contract open again, scanning the same clause she had highlighted, their expressions growing more serious with each passing second. Alicia did not speak further. She had already said enough to force the room to reevaluate everything they thought they knew about the agreement. One of the senior Japanese executives finally broke the silence, speaking in a calm but firm tone, his eyes moving between the contract and Richard. The translator struggled to keep pace, his voice less certain now, as if he too was realizing the structure he had trusted might have been incomplete. Richard adjusted his cuff slightly, a small gesture meant to restore composure. "If there is a concern," he said carefully, "we can have legal review it again immediately." Alicia turned her head slightly toward him. Her expression remained neutral, but there was a quiet precision in her attention now, as if she was no longer just observing the contract, but the system behind it. "Legal already reviewed it," she said softly, "but they reviewed the version you intended them to see." A subtle tension spread through the room at that statement. No one interrupted her, not because they agreed, but because the possibility she was describing was too specific to ignore. Richard's eyes narrowed. For the first time, his voice carried less confidence and more calculation. "That is a serious claim," he said. Alicia nodded once, acknowledging it without hesitation. She reopened the contract and turned it slightly so the Japanese delegation could see the exact line she had been referencing. "The translation here does not match the original Japanese legal phrasing," she continued. "A single modifier was altered. It changes controlled distribution across 3 subsidiaries tied to the total valuation." The room grew quieter, not out of politeness, but out of focus. The Japanese executives leaned in closer now, one of them pointing at the clause and speaking rapidly in their native language. The translator tried to keep up, but his voice faltered halfway through, as if he no longer trusted his own interpretation. Richard finally stepped closer to the table, looking down at the document with increasing intensity. The confidence he carried into the room earlier was still present in appearance, but not in certainty. Alicia continued, her tone steady and controlled. "If this agreement is executed as written in this version," she said, "then the financial distribution shifts nearly $500 million away from the intended structure." That number changed the air in the room instantly. It was no longer abstract. It was precise, measurable, and irreversible if correct. One of the advisors quickly pulled up the digital version of the contract on a tablet, comparing it line by line. His expression tightened as he confirmed discrepancies that had previously gone unnoticed. Richard noticed the reaction immediately. For the first time, he did not speak right away. He looked at Alicia, then at the Japanese delegation, then back at the document, as if trying to locate the point where control had slipped away from him. Alicia did not celebrate the moment. She simply waited, because she already knew what came next was no longer about explanation. It was about consequence. The room did not move, but something inside it had already changed direction. The contract on the table no longer felt like a document of agreement, but like a surface where hidden structure had just been exposed. Richard Bennett stood still for several seconds, his eyes locked on the same lines Alicia Carter had pointed out, now reading them with a different level of suspicion. The Japanese delegation was no longer passive. They were fully engaged, speaking quietly among themselves in rapid exchanges that the translator struggled to keep up with, his confidence visibly weakening. Alicia remained in the same position, calm and centered, as if the outcome of this moment had already been resolved long before anyone else understood the question. One of the senior executives from the Japanese side finally addressed the table directly, his tone controlled but serious. The translator hesitated before rendering the words into English, and even then, the phrasing carried uncertainty. A discrepancy of this scale, he explained, would require immediate suspension of all signing procedures until full verification was complete. The weight of that statement settled over the room instantly. Richard slowly lowered himself into his chair, not out of defeat, but recalibration. His fingers pressed lightly against the edge of the table as he reviewed the document again, this time without the assumption of correctness he had carried into the meeting. Alicia spoke only when necessary. Her voice remained steady, never raised, never emotional, only precise. She pointed out the structural pattern of the altered clauses, explaining how a single translation shift in early sections had cascaded through valuation terms across multiple subsidiaries. Each explanation was supported by direct reference to both the English and Japanese versions, showing alignment issues that had been embedded rather than accidental. The advisors in the room now fully engaged their devices, cross-checking internal records, comparing version histories, and verifying timestamps. The room, once built on confidence and expectation, was now operating in verification mode. Richard finally spoke again, but his tone had shifted from authority to controlled inquiry. He asked where she had seen the original Japanese version. Alicia paused briefly, not for hesitation, but for clarity. "I saw it when it was still unmodified," she said, "before it entered your internal review chain." That answer introduced a new layer of silence, heavier than before. It implied access, timing, and awareness that no one had accounted for. The Japanese executives exchanged another glance, this time with visible concern about procedural integrity. One of them requested a private review break, and the atmosphere shifted as chairs subtly moved and devices were pulled closer. Richard remained seated, but his focus was no longer on asserting dominance. It was on reconstructing timeline logic. He realized, quietly, that if what she was saying was accurate, then the error was not in translation alone, but in sequence control. Alicia watched this realization form without interruption. She did not need to push further. The structure of the situation was now speaking for itself. The contract remained open on the table, but no one was treating it as final anymore. It had become a reference point for something larger, something procedural, something that extended beyond this room. Richard looked at Alicia again, this time without dismissal. "You are not part of my review team," he said carefully, as if stating a fact he could still reconcile. Alicia met his gaze calmly. "I was not supposed to be in this room at all," she replied. And in that simple statement, the balance of authority in the entire negotiation shifted again, not through force, but through undeniable awareness of what had already been seen. The room had shifted into a different kind of silence, one that no longer belonged to confusion, but to evaluation. Every person present was now processing the same realization from different angles, as if the contract on the table had transformed into a live problem that could no longer be ignored or delayed. Richard Bennett remained seated, but his posture had changed subtly again, no longer projecting authority, but calculation under pressure. His eyes moved between Alicia Carter, the Japanese delegation, and the digital copies displayed on the advisor's devices, trying to reconstruct the chain of certainty he had entered the room with. Alicia stood exactly where she had been, her presence steady, not expanding, not retreating, simply anchored in clarity. One of the Japanese executives finally spoke again, this time with more urgency. The translator, visibly unsettled, delivered the message with careful phrasing. They would require a full audit of all contract versions, including metadata, timestamps, and internal revision logs before any continuation of discussion. That request immediately changed the operational status of the meeting. It was no longer a negotiation, it was now a verification process under scrutiny. Richard exhaled slowly, then leaned forward slightly, placing both hands on the table again. But this time the gesture lacked dominance and carried only focus. "If there was manipulation," he said carefully, choosing each word, "it would have required access at multiple levels of review." Alicia responded without hesitation, her tone still calm, but now more precise than before. "It did," she said, "which is why it was designed to pass unnoticed by relying on assumed trust rather than visible alteration." That statement introduced a new layer of complexity into the room. The advisors immediately began cross-referencing system logs with document history trails, and within seconds, subtle inconsistencies began appearing in the metadata records. Nothing dramatic on its own, but collectively forming a pattern that suggested coordinated adjustment rather than isolated error. The Japanese delegation grew more focused, one of them asking directly if there had been prior incidents involving version misalignment in cross-border agreements with Bennett Global Holdings. The question hung in the air longer than expected before Richard answered indirectly, stating that all previous agreements had passed standard legal verification. Alicia, however, gently interrupted the implied certainty by pointing to a structural detail in the financial distribution model that indicated pre-calculation adjustments embedded before translation even occurred. She explained it in simple terms, yet the implication was significant. The distortion was not accidental translation error, but intentional structural design. The room absorbed this without interruption. Even Richard did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked at the document again. But now it was no longer just a contract. It was a map of decisions he had not personally authorized. Alicia continued only when necessary, pointing out how the altered clause interacted with downstream valuation triggers tied to subsidiary performance thresholds. Each explanation was methodical, grounded, and consistent with both language systems, removing ambiguity rather than introducing it. One of the advisors finally confirmed aloud that the discrepancy could not exist without intentional revision at source level. That confirmation shifted the atmosphere from uncertainty to implication. Richard slowly leaned back, not in defeat, but in recognition that the structure around him was no longer fully aligned with his control. He looked at Alicia again, this time with a different kind of attention, not questioning her intelligence, but questioning how long she had understood something he had not. Alicia did not move closer, did not assert victory, did not elevate her position in the room. She simply remained present, because what was unfolding was no longer about proving knowledge. It was about revealing who had been operating on incomplete information from the beginning, and who had quietly been reading the full system while everyone else believed they were in control. The tension in the room did not disappear. It simply transformed into something more structured, like a system switching from negotiation mode to full verification mode. Every device on the table was now actively displaying synchronized document histories, and every line of data pointed toward the same unsettling conclusion that the contract had not only been altered, but carefully engineered to appear untouched. Richard Bennett remained seated, his hands now resting still in front of him, no longer signaling control, but restraint. His eyes moved slowly across the information being confirmed in real time by his advisory team, each new validation reducing the space left for denial. The Japanese delegation spoke in low, deliberate tones, their focus no longer on discussion, but on confirmation of intent and origin. Alicia Carter stood in the same position she had occupied since the beginning of the escalation, her expression unchanged, as if the outcome unfolding around her had already been anticipated long before anyone else reached this point. One of the senior advisors finally looked up from his device and delivered a quiet but definitive statement, confirming that the revision trail originated from an internal pre-approval layer that should have been inaccessible without elevated authorization credentials. That statement introduced a shift in the room that no longer depended on interpretation. It was procedural reality. Richard slowly exhaled, his gaze tightening as he absorbed the implication that the system he built had allowed a controlled distortion to pass through multiple safeguards. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he turned slightly toward Alicia, as if recalibrating not just the situation, but his understanding of who had been observing it. Alicia finally stepped forward by a single pace, not to dominate the space, but to clarify it. Her voice remained calm, but now carried a precision that felt final. She explained that the structure of the alteration was not designed to trigger alarms because it did not break rules directly. It reshaped interpretation boundaries within acceptable formatting ranges, exploiting assumptions rather than errors. The Japanese executives listened carefully, one of them requesting immediate suspension of all execution pathways until independent forensic audit could be completed. The translator delivered this with visible hesitation, aware that every word now carried contractual weight beyond conversation. Richard leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing not at Alicia, but at the realization that oversight had been bypassed through complexity rather than force. For the first time, his voice softened, not in defeat, but in recognition of scale. He asked Alicia directly how long she had been aware of the discrepancy. She did not answer with emotion or hesitation. She simply stated that she noticed it the moment she reviewed the original linguistic alignment before cross-reference indexing began. That answer shifted attention across the entire table again, not because it was dramatic, but because it was structurally impossible to ignore. One of the advisors quietly confirmed that her interpretation aligned with the forensic reconstruction now appearing on screen, showing a divergence introduced before final legal certification. The Japanese delegation exchanged a final look, and one of them formally requested withdrawal of signing intent pending full investigation. The atmosphere in the room settled into controlled silence, the kind that follows irreversible recognition rather than confusion. Richard remained seated, but the authority that once defined his presence in the room no longer extended beyond observation. He looked at Alicia again, this time without corporate framing, without assumption, only acknowledgement of clarity that had existed outside his awareness. Alicia did not celebrate the moment, did not assert dominance, and did not claim victory. She simply remained present, because what had just unfolded was not a confrontation between individuals, but a revelation of systems, assumptions, and overlooked intelligence operating beneath visible control. The contract remained on the table, but it no longer represented agreement or failure. It now represented exposure. And in that quiet aftermath, the only thing still moving with certainty was the understanding that what had been dismissed as invisible had just rewritten a $500 million decision without raising its voice once. The atmosphere inside the glass meeting room remained unchanged on the surface, but everything beneath it had already shifted into a new reality. The contract that once represented a confident expansion strategy was now being treated as a compromised system artifact, displayed across multiple devices as teams initiated full structural review protocols. Richard Bennett remained seated, but the stillness in his posture no longer projected authority. It reflected containment, as if he was holding back the full recognition of how deeply the situation had extended beyond a simple contractual dispute. Across the table, Alicia Carter stood in the same position, her presence steady and unassuming, yet now functioning as the central reference point of every conversation in the room without her needing to assert it. The Japanese delegation had formally paused all engagement, and their representatives were now communicating directly with internal legal oversight teams through secure channels, requesting verification of every revision layer, including pre-translation metadata and access logs. The translator, once confident in his role as intermediary, now remained silent unless directly addressed, aware that the linguistic structure itself had become evidence. Richard finally broke his silence, not with accusation, but with controlled inquiry. He asked his legal advisor how such a modification could pass through multi-stage verification without triggering escalation alerts. The advisor hesitated before responding, explaining that the system had not failed in a traditional sense, but had been guided through compliant formatting pathways that masked intent behind procedural alignment. That explanation did not ease the tension, it deepened it. Alicia stepped forward slightly, not interrupting, but adding clarity where abstraction had begun to take over. She explained that systems designed for trust often assume integrity in early-stage inputs, and when that assumption is leveraged correctly, structural distortion can appear indistinguishable from legitimate revision. Her tone remained calm, but the implication carried weight that extended beyond the room itself. Richard watched her closely now, no longer evaluating her as an external variable, but as someone operating with an understanding of systems he had personally overseen. A quiet notification appeared on multiple devices at once, indicating that the Japanese delegation had escalated the matter to executive review and suspended all financial execution pathways pending independent audit confirmation. The shift was immediate and irreversible in operational terms. Richard leaned back slightly, absorbing the reality that what had been a $500 million agreement was now transitioning into a full-scale compliance investigation. He asked Alicia, almost quietly, whether she had anticipated this level of impact when she first spoke. Alicia did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked at the contract still open on the table, as if confirming that the structure she had identified had fully revealed itself in consequence. When she finally spoke, her words were measured and precise. She stated that impact was not the objective, accuracy was. And when accuracy is ignored long enough, consequence becomes unavoidable rather than intentional. That statement settled heavily across the room, not as philosophy, but as operational truth. One of the senior Japanese executives acknowledged her contribution formally through the translator, stating that without her intervention, the structural discrepancy would have proceeded into execution phase undetected. Richard remained silent for several seconds, then slowly shifted his attention back to the contract, now fully reframed as a system failure rather than a negotiation tool. For the first time since the meeting began, he did not attempt to reassert authority or reinterpret the situation in his favor. Instead, he acknowledged the procedural reality unfolding in front of him. Alicia Carter was no longer being observed as a waitress who spoke unexpectedly. She was now being recognized as the only reason a $500 million structural deviation had been identified before activation. And in that recognition, the entire definition of who held control in the room had permanently changed, not through confrontation, but through undeniable clarity that no authority structure could override. The silence that followed the formal escalation request was no longer uncertain. It had become procedural, structured, and irreversible. Across the glass meeting room in Manhattan, devices displayed synchronized audit protocols now actively running through every layer of the contract history, pulling timestamps, revision fingerprints, and authorization trails into a unified investigation stream. The Japanese delegation had fully transitioned from negotiation to verification oversight, their communication now directed toward internal compliance authorities rather than the individuals in the room. Richard Bennett remained seated, his posture no longer representing authority or resistance, but controlled reflection under institutional scrutiny. Alicia Carter stood at the same position she had maintained throughout the entire sequence of events, no longer treated as an external participant, but now functioning as the reference point around which the entire investigation had formed. No one in the room was speaking over her anymore. They were speaking through systems she had already forced into visibility. One of the senior compliance officers, connected remotely through secure channel, confirmed that the modification pattern identified in the contract matched a known structural exploitation method involving layered translation, dependency, and pre-certification formatting bias. The confirmation did not create shock, but alignment. It validated what had already been demonstrated through Alicia's analysis. Richard slowly exhaled, looking down at the document as if seeing it for the first time without assumption or ownership. He asked quietly whether this type of manipulation could have occurred without internal awareness. The compliance officer responded that system design intentionally assumes trust at early ingestion layers, and that when that assumption is exploited through compliant structure rather than direct breach, detection often occurs only after external validation forces re-examination. Alicia listened without interruption, her focus steady, as the room absorbed the implications of that explanation. She finally stepped slightly closer to the table, not to emphasize her presence, but to close the distance between interpretation and understanding. She stated calmly that systems built on assumed integrity will always appear stable until someone evaluates them without trusting the surface structure. Her words were not framed as accusation, but as observation, derived from pattern recognition. The Japanese delegation formally acknowledged through their representative that the structural integrity of the agreement could no longer be certified, and that all financial execution steps would remain suspended indefinitely pending full forensic reconstruction. The translator delivered this with careful neutrality, but the meaning carried finality that no negotiation language could soften. Richard did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked across the table, not at the advisors, not at the contract, but at Alicia Carter. For the first time since the meeting began, his expression did not attempt to interpret her role within his system. It simply registered her position within reality. He asked her, in a quiet voice, whether she had any prior involvement in contract architecture or legal structuring. Alicia paused briefly before responding that she had not, and that her understanding came from observation of inconsistencies rather than access to authority. That answer did not elevate her status through declaration. It clarified it through limitation overcome. The room remained still as the final system logs completed synchronization, confirming that the discrepancy originated from pre-integration staging rather than post-approval manipulation. That distinction redefined everything that had occurred. It confirmed that what had been dismissed earlier as improbable interpretation was in fact structural detection. Richard slowly leaned back in his chair, no longer attempting to reclaim control of the situation, but acknowledging its resolution outside his authority. The contract remained open on the table, but it had lost its operational meaning. It was now evidence of exposure, not agreement. Alicia Carter did not speak further. She did not need to. The system had already responded to her presence with irreversible correction. And in the quiet aftermath of that realization, the room understood a final truth without it needing to be stated. Visibility is not granted by position, but revealed by accuracy, and once revealed, it cannot be undone.